Hello everyone, I'm Walt Murray with Master Control, quality management software organization, also with supportive services in consulting for clients who are either developing, improving, or implementing quality management systems. So today we're now going into the second part of a three-part series, and this particular part has to do with getting ready for the standard, which is now officially out as of March 1st of 2016. And the 13485 standard replaces the 2008 revision, as well as, of course, for the ISO 9001, and also the 13485 for the 2003 revision. So companies now, of course, have 3 years from that date to plan and implement the transition of their system before 2019, March of 2019, to the new standard for certification purposes, for conformance. So what we want to do is talk about, in this part, is some high-level considerations and things. We're going through this, what do I think about, what do I do, how do I do it, how do I present to management the importance of what it is I'm about to engage in, how does it affect my ability to make product, design product, how does it affect the way in which our organization may operate as a result of this system. So today in part two, we're going to really get into kind of the guts of some of the more interesting things that present challenges possibly and considerations. And then in part three, we will definitely get into the juice, the meat of talking about some of these caveats and challenges that you'll be faced with as you start to plan for the change in the standard. So as we look at some of the universal changes that are being considered, one of those is that the new system, the new standard, finally gets around to talking about the entire life cycle of the product as a standard. So what has been typically the gravitation to a product standard, with the addition of the services orientation that may become certified to this standard, and the change in the marketplace has really pushed this life cycle approach. And the main reason for that, of course, is that now it's common for companies to outsource, to look for things out of their wheelhouse, find people and organizations who are good and much better than they are at various opportunities relative to making the product, moving the product, actually using the product in the clinical sense or in the life science sense, okay? So I would think that the major thrust here, we're probably all painfully aware of this and maybe even a little nauseous over the term, but the requirement is now being pushed in terms of a risk-based approach, okay? What that means, though, is that there's a couple of things about the standard to consider. One is risk is presented if your system is not fully integrated. So a fully integrated approach of QMS processes is imperative. As a matter of fact, one of the things that's now a major component of this system in and of itself is the ability to look at, audit, do the things that require evaluating the system, that the system is not at risk on the basis of, say, the vertical nature of processes. It's very hard and has always been very hard for organizations, especially the larger ones. As you grow, you become more vertical, less integrated in terms of the idea that everybody's in the same room, you got 7 or 8 people and they all get along, and when they need to say something, all they need to do is yell across to the desk next to them. Now you're in 3 different buildings in 3 different states around the country, and time doesn't always allow you the way you want to fully integrate an organization so it runs smoothly. One of the things now that a quality management system has become is the method, tool, or the business system orientation, because of the requirements that lie at the doorstep of your organization. I mean, I think it's all important for us to know and understand that product is not product without documents. So literally, you have to think in terms of, if I make a product, I visually have to think that everything around that product that's documented is bolted to that thing. And if it goes out the door without the documents, it's missing a steering wheel, it's missing a wheel, there's a component of the car that doesn't allow it to function. That's how you have to look at it in terms of documentation relative to product. That being the case, documents present their own conundrum in terms of risk and understanding how they work to define, assess, define, and execute an organization around a product. Therefore, the importance of life cycle. Okay? So outsourcing can be a major challenge. Now that some organizations just do design house concerns, some organizations just do the manufacturing, some organizations just do the testing. But somebody has to be responsible. Somebody has to be where the buck stops relative to a product when there are problems or there are issues. And that has to be defined in the context of the organization and the control of those processes internally or externally around that product. Okay? So design controls. Design controls now have much more importance around the understanding of product characteristics and considerations as to how those present risk, and then how are they controlled based on risk. I think probably one of the things you may or may not be hearing a lot about is that this standard, by virtue of following the new 9001 2015 standard, things that in the past have been implicit in terms of consideration and execution now are being stated explicitly in terms of the execution of these processes. Mainly because inside these processes now are inherent risk and opportunity analysis, and that does not go away just because this standard looks like the 2008. It simply doesn't. It's there. It will be there for the full realm of the opportunities related to the standard, as well as the risk-based approach. I think the other thing that's also very true about this system is that what needs to be visible now is all the other standards and guidelines that help to round out an organization in terms of its system must not only just be considered, but must be also referenced and applied. A couple good examples that I've given here, one that's more traditional in nature, the 60601 for electrical risks related to a product and safety relative to that product. And also one that's not mentioned very much, but has become more center stage because of software around medical device, is the life cycle of software related either to the medical device directly or the use of indirect conditions that could be high risk oriented for a system. So ISO 62304 is a software life cycle standard that is used to support a product that is very software oriented. Now, increasing, one of the things that's very interesting is because software is a bigger part of this, because the intricacy of technical requirements and application to products, the interest that I find is that there's more of the human factor thought processes around execution of things are being built through software into the product and its execution. So as a result of that, software now comes under a lot of scrutiny in the form of validation and verification in the design process and then in the execution of that process. These concepts now become the integration of understanding what traditionally has been process control to software systems control as part of that. So the natural condition for software, which has been around the IQ, OQ, PQ orientation, now becomes a part of looking at risk as it's related to process design, operational qualification, and then performance in the form of product and process control. not performance qualification. A lot of people might say, well, Walt, isn't that really the same thing? No, it's not. It's not, because risk carries through in design for process design and is only qualified operationally in order to go into a state of process control verification based on process design. And then, of course, the other thing that has also happened and has been interesting as the evolution has occurred around software implications to medical device has been a guideline that comes out of Europe, the SAAMD, which is a guideline on software as a medical device, and is being considered in many circles relative to the FDA's influence on medical device companies, especially where you're talking about high classification considerations and conditions around the use of implantables, the use of devices that create high risk in their environment. So some of the general caveats to the new edition, I just want to point out real quick. If we look at the lay of the land, of course, now instead of the 4 through 8 line items you used to have in the old standard, now you have 4 through 10. That's because there have been some significant introduction of new elements based on the understanding of risk and improvement as an outcome of a risk-based standard. And so how do you look at improvement from a verification and validation standpoint at the level of management? I'm going to show even in the line items themselves that it becomes more explicit to relate metrics around the concept of improvement on the basis of how the organization has created and executed its objectives, its quality objectives. So if we go through these now, what we're talking about is introduction for the organization is to take the organization in its defined context. An org chart used to be great in the past, not anymore. Now an organization must define its context in terms of execution. And by way of that, of course, in the preface section, we're actually talking about the importance that trade secrets play as a role in being tempered as a quality organization around what is and what is not to be used as part of the system based on those secrets. Definitions. There are several more. There are several clarifications. One of the first things someone should do when they get their hands on the standard is go straight to the definition section and read these definitions, because they have changed, they have been added, they have been clarified, and it's important before you go look at the standard and try to really understand it. You first have to say, when they define risk or they define risk management, what do they really mean? How are they different? And how does that influence the way in which we're going to improve our system and its approach? Big bibliographies now. I've never seen a bibliography more in the proper context of associating guidelines and documentation influencing the development of this standard, and the use of those bibliographies now as references as you're considering how you're going to create a quality plan for change. And it's also important to understand, lastly, but very important, is this section 4.2.5 in the record section in the front of the standard, where it basically warns the public around the medical device companies to say, okay, because of the influence of software, because of the influence of the nature of technology, we can no longer look at a system on a very basic level. Because of these changes, we now need to take into account the use of software, which means we need to look at security. We need to look at the sensitivity to records like HIPAA records or health information. And the electronic data management system now has to take on this significant role of how information is retrieved, how it's vaulted or how it's secured, the availability based on the use of those venues in the cloud, or where that documentation moves, that it has the appropriate level that documented information should have around these concepts. So basically, nothing's out. we want to talk about what's in. So I think probably the old indigestion adage that, you know, you're not going to get away with what you already know about the system. Now we're going to add a few more things for you to consider. The caveat there, though, is that this really should provide some simplicity to the organization around being effective in the use of resources qualified by the concept of a risk-based approach. So, first of all, the quality manual stays. There have been all these rumors flying around getting rid of a quality manual. Under some circles are in the 9001 level of opportunity. That is true. You can have an aggressive quality plan, control measures, and some other possibilities for documentation that would support the system as opposed to having a quality manual, mainly because a quality manual has been thought to be very static. When I go and speak, I'm always amazed when I ask the simple question, when was the last time somebody read their quality manual or pulled it out just to look at certain conditions for clarification, and I get no hands. That's not only scary, but it actually speaks to the fact that these documents are not being prepared in a way that they're usable and effective. The idea behind now having very specific requirements for a medical device file, which basically is the idea around the European campaign for quality and the idea of a dossier or a technical file, in the sense that that now has to be a formality in terms of documentation in your system. Management review now has some interesting caveats relative to separation of items that before have been, you can just kind of smash them together. Now corrective action and preventive action are separate items in management review. The elements in the old system called monitoring and measurement of product and monitoring and measurement of process are now line items in management review. And of course, in the outputs, there is also a new line item that is there that we're going to speak to in just a minute relative to design and some other considerations for management's input. As I mentioned, the corrective preventive action are distinctly separate. The FDA has always looked at these as separate items and never really, as much as we want to say they never really have looked at corrective and preventive action truly as a kappa. But that term is so embedded in our thinking, in terms of life science for corrective and preventive action. The problem there is that it has been distinctly oriented for use in understanding that if I have a problem and I react to it, I put in place corrective control measures or actions that allow me to eliminate the root cause of that. Now it's suggesting, hey, wait a minute, that's part of corrective action. Preventive action is truly in and of itself an action for control measures taken for avoidance and control. So if you truly look at an event or a condition or an issue, you have now two distinct sides to this. You have the side that says, can we put control measures in place and know through a trigger that they can be handled to eliminate or avoid the risk and have an opportunity to do that? Or on the other side of the event, do we have kind of a fault tree analysis that allows us to say, what are the contingencies that we will trigger in order to minimize and mitigate the effect of that event? In terms of training and competency, I think the major thing under this note relative to training now in terms of people's ability to do their job is risk-based, completely risk-based. Meaning that if you have a person who is having something to do with directly affecting the product, moderate to serious, or even things like testing the product, moderate to serious, any of those relationships in your environment that create risk, the training for the people who have hands-on or deal with that must be commensurate to the risk. So, if I can use an example to make the point, if your product is very susceptible to endotoxin conditions relative to the manufacturing of that product, should the person who's responsible for either the outsourcing of that product to a lab or the internal processing of in and of themselves around understanding the testing mechanism for detection. That person must clearly understand the application of that by virtue of those hands-on processes and the understanding of the data and information to deal with it. Some of that may require not being able to get beyond someone who has a postdoctorate level of education in some cases. In some cases, it can be a certificate, but then the certificate must have the validity associated with it to show the records that say, clearly this person understands what's going on, has the ability to make decisions and take actions appropriate. Okay? Most of the documentation in one or more of the processes, risk is clearly explicit when we're talking about the provision of the product or the service in question. Okay? 7.1, of course, is the realization planning, what we've known as the realization planning component of our system. And it's important that risk activities are very visible and are maintained. Let me use a basic example to make the point here. There's a need for the right people, talented people, say in a cross-functional mode, on the basis of the nature of the objective, to develop a visual planning document around risk. And that visual planning document should have associated with it across the board everything from what may be what we typically might consider a failure mode type of thing, and it could be around various elements of the process. So you could, for instance, take each activity step for a given process and look at risks and opportunities in form of problems and opportunities, and look at root causes. Look at how control will matter relative to that root cause. Is it going to be a preventive condition? Is it going to be a mitigative condition? Will there be visible triggers explained for the opportunity to do either avoidance or mitigation? And more importantly, this application builds at a hierarchy. So first is this planning and risk analysis at the system level. Then there is the same thing at the operation or process level. Then there is the same kind of risk planning at the day-to-day level, which typically gets a lot of scrutiny, and everything above it is like, we're in control, don't worry about it. Reality is that that's not true, and here's why. In the new standard, risk-based decision-making has become a serious and important principle in how a system is executed. And if that principle is not shown to be visible and actionable, then you are at risk. And I'll point out a very specific thing in understanding this. In a process, it's not the activities A, B, C, D, E that matter, because those processes in and of themselves are actionable and straightforward. It is the white space that occurs between those boxes where somebody's going to take some data or take some information, and they're going to make a decision based on that information that will alter inputs to the next activity in that line of activities in that process. So what happens then if you have, say, 7 activity steps, which means you have 6 white spaces across there for input-output conditions relative to information? Somebody's making a decision. Okay, and remember, an activity is a set of action points based on actioning on those steps, one, another, and another in a set. In a process, you still have that white space between those activities where something's happening, either in the form of project management, in the form of assessment relative to the data. There's all sorts of things going on there. And do you control the risks associated with that white space activity? Okay? Very important. And so in the design and development, we have one that is referred to as now transfer, and it is specific to understanding change conditions outlined within the design aspect of the product. And what is the importance of risk management around those processes for design control? And you know, I have been internally with organizations, many organizations, where you have that adage, once design is done with it, they pull the pin on the hand grenade and they chuck it over the wall, and manufacturing now owns it, okay? That in itself, that statement in and of itself, realizes significant risks. Having been a design engineer myself in industry early on and taking things from the lab countertop to a manufacturing realm creates many different issues associated with risk relative to such things as taking engineered material on a machine that has been designed to run a certain way and making certain assumptions. As soon as those assumptions come about, risk has been introduced to the transfer of the design of that product. So there should be as much input relative to what the process is designed to do or will be designed to do on influence in the design environment relative to the product. In the standard, one of the key changes for an introduction of a new element is the customer handling criteria that are now unique to the consideration around product, and in doing that, looking at those criteria from a decision-making mode, how a condition for handling customer-specific issues is escalated based on risk relative to the feedback that comes from the customer, either in the form of a complaint or in the form of formal feedback or whatever that may be. There are 6 specific customer handling criteria that need to be considered as part of that overall consideration in the escalation of an issue and how it's handled. Of course, CAPA being the highest point of escalation in that consideration for common cause project management of those criteria around the issue for the customer. So basically nothing's going away, but there are all these interesting things coming into what already is a challenge for us in looking at medical device conformance. Okay, so one of the things in this standard I find to be very valuable in a change is the idea behind the use of the annex guidance that is now there in this standard. And of course that follows through from the influence of 9001:2015, again in the appendix. The SL guidance considerations are very similar, and this is where this becomes a good reference point for you to go to as you go through this standard and make some decisions around improvement. First of all, there's some roughly 57 additions relative to the points of those additions in the new standard that you need to look at that are actually brought out as line items in comparison relative to the old standard. Okay. The annex provides alerts that are unique relative to the changes between the old standard, the 2003 revision and the 2016 revision. Also provides explanation and clarifications to eliminate any ambiguity in many of the existing elements of the 13485. All items are designed to convey the explicit nature of the actions that are taken that before were implied. So literally, if you look at these comparisons, it helps you to understand, okay, this one's no longer implicit. It's no longer a coulda, shoulda. It's a very explicit, this is an explicit condition, and here's the data, the information, the analysis that needs to be had in order for this to take place by element, okay? And then provides guidance in terms of first, second, and third party orientation to developing checklists for the new audit routine or the new audit orientation of a risk-based consideration for those components that need to be there in actually auditing the new quality management system under 2016. Very, very important. So Annex B then, first it aligns the standard, the second standard to the first standard, okay? B1 actually aligns the 13485 2016 to the 9001 2015. Very, very important to analyze and consider what these changes are by studying that annex. B2 then aligns the 9001 2015 in the other direction with the 13485 2016. So the organization can have a starting point either way relative to understanding what the changes are, what the explicit nature of those changes are, and what the risk consideration is in making risk-based decisions in deploying a new system. It allows the organization to start with that standard of application that makes sense to the company in terms of its context, the organizational context. Okay? Each line item will alter, add, or show no equivalent to the standard by comparison. So it's important to look at the nature of the comparison and get a feel for any one of those conditions that you may need to consider as you put your plan together. So what's next? In part 3, what we're going to do is we're going to take and look at, on a risk-based orientation, the scale of opportunity relative to tips for transitioning, and by looking at various, if you would, families of product in that orientation as we go through the consideration for some of these that may create some serious conundrum in terms of the risk-based orientation of your product. We don't want you to wait, so we're actually going to make a fairly quick turn on this third part. It probably will be a slightly extended time frame based on the things we're going to cover. And of course, you have 3 years to do this, so there's no time to wait. Right now, it'll be the end of the year before you know it. And of course, as experience has basically taught me, most implementations to change to a system occurs in the last 8 months of the 3rd year, and in sometimes even less than that. That course in and of itself exposes you because you're showing that you're putting yourself at risk. Okay? So don't wait. Start looking at this standard, understanding it, dissect it, look at those things that really are going to matter on a scale of risk relative to your organization. And then be aware, even now, be aware of the use of the advantage and the use of your internal audit to find those holes in your existing system by auditing to those elements in the new standard. So right now, your internal audit or first-party audit, or maybe even a second-party audit, should be risk deployed based on the conditions from the old way to the new way relative to the system. Okay? If you have a dual certification quandary relative to understanding that you're 2008 now, you're going to roll over your 13485, but if you're currently certified to 2018, excuse me, to 2008, and you've got to get ready for that standard, you need to look at the context of 9001 to 13485 and make sure that you prepare for both, most of it being pointed, if you would, in the direction of 9001 2015, and then, of course, use your internal audit process again, or an audit process based on an external auditor who may have the experience around understanding these things, to start to arrange for those changes based on the application of a risk-based approach. Okay? The key, I mentioned here, the key is to embed principles and requirements using good references back and forth relative to what you're doing. Whichever way you do it, coming from either side, from the 9001 side, the 13485 side, make sure your references are solid, that your rationale around those references are solid, and realize that in doing that, you're actually improving the risk consideration relative to your QMS and your processes. So what about I'm going to introduce one other thing for consideration. There's going to be some sweeping changes in the European campaign relative to the overhaul and elimination of the existing MDD medical device directives in Europe. And what does that mean for medical devices in 2016? Well, first of all, there's got to be changes because there's approximately 134 additional pages that are being added to the directive. That just simply means there may be a lot more clarification for reducing ambiguity, alignment with other programs like the FDA program and other programs around the world, Health Canada, and also looking at understanding the importance of the alignment in the new standard itself, okay, relative to a risk-based process. So, as we close out, I want you to be aware that the part 3 of this series will be coming soon. We'll be making a fairly quick turn on this to get part 3 into your hands, as we're aware that you should have already come up with management review, discussion and orientation and understanding to the changes that you have to make to your system. And that management review should have already initialized some exposure for awareness as a heads up as to what's involved here. And so we will be putting together some much more specific example-oriented and condition-oriented product family type discussion with regard to the implementation of the new 13485 2016 standard as our part 3 in this series. Thank you very much.